We've spent $6 trillion to hear the same story. The Earth is dying and you, the American people, must pay to stop it. That sentence, printed in red ink at the top of a classified memo, is not a headline, but a summary conclusion from more than a decade of unchecked climate funding. Across Capitol Hill, Senator John Kennedy's office glowed with the pale blue of a computer screen. It was nearly midnight. The Senate was empty, but the lights were still on in this room. Ron Johnson paced the room, seemingly deep in thought, holding a printout marked Internal Unreviewed GAO Disbursement Summary. On the screen behind him, two sets of data flashed side by side. On the left was the colorful IPC projection curve, smooth and steep. On the right was the black and white Vasto chart, rough, and composed of 440,000 years of atmospheric data. Kennedy stared at it without blinking. "We were given a model," he muttered. "But the tape tells a different story." Standing near the window, Ron Johnson tapped his fingers on the glass, watching the Capitol dome light up under the floodlights. "They spent more than $6 trillion, he said. "And not once did we measure success by results. It was all emergencies, disasters, sacrifice, but not one graph showed how much cooler the world got." He turned and dropped a thick file on the table. "This is from a study of northern forest fires. Natural fires in the northern forest emit more carbon in 1 year than the entire U.S. economy did 2 decades ago. Yet, the Deflationary Reduction Act wants Americans to pay $1.2 trillion to offset a third of that." Kennedy didn't budge. "And no one mentioned it on TV," he said grimly. He clicked on another file, a PDF titled World Climate Statement Restricted. The name scrolled slowly. Physicists, geologists, meteorologists, more than 1,800 signatories, including 2 Nobel Prize winners in physics. The statement read, "There is no climate emergency." But at the bottom of the screen, it read "Access denied." Library of Congress Archive. Kennedy's hands hovered over the keyboard. "They didn't refute it," he said. "They just made sure it was never cited." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Omission by obfuscation," he said. "And the models we've funded all come back to the same story. Man-made carbon is the enemy. But if CO2 is rising after temperature," Kennedy added, pointing to the Vasto data, "then we've been chasing a shadow." A beat passed. Johnson opened another folder. "Are you ready to bring this up?" Kennedy nodded. "It doesn't belong in the drawer anymore." He picked up a red folder labeled Witness Review. Energy and Climate Watch, placed it on the table, and tapped it twice. "We need a hearing. And not a closed hearing." Johnson agreed immediately. "Barrasso is a guy who can clear the floor. He's seen parts of this." Kennedy dialed. The line rang once. "Senator Barrasso speaking." Kennedy got to the point. "We have credible evidence of falsified climate models, suppressed scientific dissent, and $6 trillion spent without any measurable benchmarks. This demands a public hearing." There was a pause. Then Barrasso's voice returned, calm and firm. "I'll schedule it. You'll have a chair, and the media will not be shut out." Kennedy hung up. The room fell silent. The CNN feed was still playing silently on the wall. The headline read, "UN Secretary General, Climate Disaster at the Door." Kennedy turned it off. "They want disaster," he said. "We'll let them know." He turned to Johnson. "Get the files ready. We'll go public." Johnson nodded and walked toward the door. Kennedy was still sitting at his desk, his hands flat on the surface, his eyes fixed on the Vasto chart still glowing on the screen. There was no applause, no musical numbers, just silence and the soft click of a file being copied to a flash drive. Outside, Capitol Hill was asleep. But inside this room, the fuse had been lit. The morning sun shone directly into the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee chamber. But the air inside was already heavy. It was just past 9 a.m. when the gavel came down. Cameras clicked, screens flickered, and rows of media sat rigid in anticipation. Chairman John Barrasso opened the hearing with a firm voice. "This committee is now in session for the purpose of reviewing federal climate spending, public modeling standards, and the integrity of scientific review." He did not raise his voice, but the silence afterward felt colder than any northern boil wind. Senator John Kennedy was seated to his left, papers in order, red folder front and center. Ron Johnson leaned slightly back, arms crossed, watching the Democrat bench with calm suspicion. On the other side, Jamie Raskin stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a line, flanked by Ed Markey and Alex Padilla, both flipping through briefing notes but not speaking. Raskin broke the stillness. "Mr. Chairman, I must formally object. This hearing is not about oversight. It is a denial spectacle targeting settled science and funded solutions. Barrasso didn't blink. Objection noted. The hearing will proceed. Kennedy didn't wait for ceremony. He rose, lifted a single sheet of paper, and walked to the microphone. $6 trillion, ladies and gentlemen. That's what the American taxpayer has poured into climate programs. And not once, has this chamber received a definitive answer to the most basic question. What did it buy us? He turned to face Raskin. Not slogans. Not projections. Measurable results. Raskin raised a finger. The results are the avoided catastrophes. The mitigated damage. This is what it means to be proactive. Kennedy didn't budge. Then show me the numbers. Because right now, what I have is data showing that the most aggressive government climate spending of our lifetime has failed to alter a single observable global trend. He tapped the screen behind him. The Vosto graph appeared, 400,000 years of ice core readings. This is the Earth's record, Kennedy said, voice steady. Temperature spikes precede CO2 increases, which means we've been funding the reversal of reality. Padilla leaned in but said nothing. Johnson spoke up. If you want to be proactive, fine. But don't call it science if you can't measure the outcome. Barrasso allowed a pause, letting the words settle. The room was frozen in its own quiet tension. Jamie Raskin leaned forward now, louder, voice edged. You're not asking questions. You're undermining consensus. You are giving cover to fossil fuel lobbyists who have denied and delayed and discredited real environmental reform for 40 years. Kennedy turned slowly. Consensus is not evidence. And if questioning the use of $6 trillion makes me a threat to your lobby, then your science is not built on fact. It's built on funding. The first murmur moved through the press row. Barrasso adjusted his microphone. This hearing is not for campaign statements. This is a matter of public accounting. Kennedy nodded and clicked the screen to a second data set. Wildfire emissions from boreal forests, year 2021. He let it hang for a moment. In one season, he said, these fires released twice the CO2 of the entire world economy in 2001. Yet, we're being told $1.2 trillion in subsidies will somehow reverse that by 2030. He pointed at Raskin. Is this science, or is it superstition with a budget? Raskin leaned back now, silent. His jaw clenched. The chart behind Kennedy glowed in stark red lines. The jagged ancient black lines of the Vosto ice core graph filled the display. Each rise and fall tracing a world long before the SUV or smokestack. 5 distinct cycles, Kennedy said, stepping away from the podium and into the open floor. Temperature rises, then CO2 follows every single time. We're talking about over 400,000 years. But we're spending money as if carbon came first. He glanced toward the Democrat bench. If cause and effect still mean anything, then this data means something. And if it doesn't, then so does nothing else we're doing. The room stayed still. Jamie Raskin adjusted his glasses, leaned into the microphone. Senator Kennedy is offering a seductive distortion. VTO data, for all its interest, cannot be used to dismiss modern atmospheric dynamics. We are no longer in the Pleistocene. Kennedy didn't hesitate. Then explain why your climate models ignore it. Why every chart used to justify $6 trillion is based on one predictive loop and not one historic record. Raskin shot back, louder now. Because historical lag does not disprove causality in the current feedback system. We are in a different era with different mechanisms at work. These are not cave paintings. They're ecosystems collapsing. Johnson leaned forward. That's a beautiful slogan, but what he's asking is simple. If this data shows CO2 is not the driver of climate change, then why is every policy we fund pretending it is? Padilla interrupted cautiously. Because current emissions are at levels unseen in natural cycles, and our models reflect urgency based on modern acceleration. Kennedy walked back to his desk. Urgency is not a substitute for proof, and unseen doesn't mean unnatural. It means not yet graphed. He picked up a folder and held it up. This is a technical review signed by independent climatologists, many of whom were denied peer journals for submitting analysis that contradicted IPCC assumptions. We don't have consensus. We have censorship. Raskin's tone sharpened. We have peer review. We have reproducible science. What we don't have is time to indulge political theater. Kennedy stared at him across the table. What we don't have is honesty about who gets funded and who gets deleted. Johnson added coldly. I'd like to enter this document into the record. Barrasso from the chair nodded without pause. So entered. Kennedy turned again toward the screen. This isn't speculation. These are IC records pulled from Antarctica. They're not opinion polls. They're the Earth's testimony. He let the silence hang, then tapped the desk. And now we go to the voices no one in this building wants to acknowledge. He unfolded a printout thick with signatures, clipped with a handwritten note that read, "Suppressed in 2022. Then he looked up, voice level. 1,800 scientists. 2 Nobel Prize winners. All of them agree there is no climate emergency. The last line dropped into the chamber like stone into still water. No one moved. The only sound was the faint whir of the overhead projector, and Kennedy, eyes fixed forward, did not blink. The thick document sat on the witness table like a quiet insult. The top page listed names, dozens at first, then hundreds, clearly printed with affiliations from national labs, universities, and institutes the public was told to trust. This list, Kennedy said calmly, includes physicists, geochemists, environmental statisticians, even 2 Nobel laureates, and they're all saying the same thing. There is no climate emergency. A low rustle moved through the press gallery. One reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. Ron Johnson tapped the desk twice. We've entered this declaration into the record. We did it last year. They ignored it. Jamie Raskin sat forward, elbows on the table, face sharpened with frustration. This isn't science, he snapped. This is a political stunt disguised as peer review. That declaration was not vetted by any recognized journal. It's a statement of ideological dissent, not scientific process. Kennedy didn't flinch. You mean it wasn't vetted by the journals funded by the same networks that benefit from carbon panic? I understand. Raskin raised his voice. No, I mean it wasn't published because it doesn't meet the rigor of scientific consensus. Johnson jumped in. Consensus is not science. Galileo didn't get consensus either. The room stirred again. Alex Padilla tried to regain footing. The integrity of the process matters. Any group can collect names, but unless their findings go through challenge and review, they don't shape policy. Kennedy leaned in, voice firm. Then why not challenge them? Why not bring them into the discussion and prove them wrong? Why bury the data and call that safety? Raskin fired back. Because bringing in denialists to debate reality is not balance. It's regression. For the first time, John Barrasso cut in, chairing from the center. Let's clarify. Has any federal agency reviewed the findings from this declaration? Has any mainstream institution responded on record? Silence. Kennedy spoke again. No, because it's easier to ignore 1,000 dissenters than to confront the possibility that they might be right. He gestured to the press. You're watching this because the taxpayers weren't given a voice. $6 trillion. And this, he tapped the folder, was never mentioned once on cable news. Johnson opened his laptop, projected a bar chart on the screen. Here's where it gets worse. The screen showed carbon emissions from natural wildfires in boreal forests across the northern hemisphere. Russia, Canada, Alaska. This, Johnson said, is the volume of CO2 released in 2021 alone from natural fires. Twice the global total from all man-made sources in 2001. He turned to Raskin. And yet we're being told that if we spend another $1.2 trillion, we'll offset a third of that by 2030 on paper. Raskin didn't respond. His jaw was locked, hands clenched. Kennedy didn't look at him. He was already sliding another document into place. If reality doesn't fit the model, they don't fix the model. They erase reality. The lights dimmed slightly as the next chart loaded. Johnson whispered, "This is the part they won't be able to spin." The chart Johnson pulled up was simple but devastating. On the left, emissions targeted for reduction by the Inflation Reduction Act by the year 2030, measured in billions of metric tons. On the right, carbon released in a single year by boreal wildfires in 2021. The red bar towered over the green one like a slap across logic. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. According to this data, what nature released from boreal forest in one season is 3 times what your legislation hopes to remove from the air in 8 years. He turned to face the Democrat bench. So I ask again, what are we paying for? Padilla leaned in, slow and cautious. Wildfires are worsened by climate change. Reducing human emissions is one part of the solution. Kennedy stood. Nobody lives in the boreal forests. Nobody caused those fires. And yet you're telling the American worker to pay $1.2 trillion to clean up a mess that nature did by itself. And will do again. He walked back to the table. This is not about solving the problem. It's about controlling the perception of one. Raskin exhaled hard. We are trying to save the planet. Senator Kennedy. You're trying to save X and mobile. Acronym. The room went tight. A reporter lowered his camera just to catch that line clean. Kennedy didn't respond immediately. He paced then stopped. I'm trying to save the truth. You're trying to sell inevitability as morality. Johnson cut in. And what is the endgame? Will we spend another trillion if the next forest fire beats this one? Will we tax every rancher, every trucker, every power plant just to say we did something, even if that something does nothing? Raskin replied. We either act now or lose what cannot be replaced. Kennedy stared at him. Then explain why the money we already spent hasn't replaced a single burned tree or cooled a single degree. The screen flicked again, this time showing a satellite image from the Economist report. A smoky swirl across the Arctic blotting out the northern hemisphere. The caption read, Boreal Fire Season 2021. Largest carbon event in decades. Padilla shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Johnson didn't let up. It's not just ineffective, it's dishonest. Because while you chase trillion-dollar dreams, the reality outside burns bigger, hotter, and without permission. Barrasso didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The weight in the room had shifted. Even the staffers weren't typing. The sound of one phone vibrating on silent broke the hush. Raskin looked down but didn't answer it. Kennedy opened a folder slowly. This wasn't a debate anymore. It's now a record. And as he prepared the next document, the temperature in the room felt like it dropped again. Senator Kennedy reached under the table and pulled out a laminated chart, placing it flat beside the microphone. The title read, Global Food Dependency, Fertilizer Production by Fuel Source. Beneath it, a single figure was circled in red. For billion people, he said, letting the words fall slowly. That's how many human beings depend on ammonia-based fertilizers made using natural gas. Cut that line and you collapse food supply chains across half the planet. He looked directly at Jamie Raskin. So before you draft your next plan to eliminate carbon, I have one question. What do you intend to feed them with? Raskin adjusted his microphone. Senator, no one is suggesting an immediate end to natural gas. Not immediate, Kennedy snapped. But you already cut pipelines, blocked refineries, and sanctioned the very tools we need to keep people alive. You just do it with language soft enough to fit into a speech. Johnson picked up. You said transition, but you never said how, and certainly never said who would starve while you figured it out. Padilla tried to interject. The plan is gradual. It's a just transition. With the right investment, we can shift towards sustainable agriculture. Kennedy didn't blink. There is no just death. His voice dropped lower. And no amount of recycled jargon will change that. Raskin spoke again, more slowly now, eyes narrowing. This is a moral challenge. Climate justice will demand sacrifice. History will remember who stood firm. Johnson leaned forward. History remembers hunger, not hashtags. The press row stirred. Barrasso leaned back in his chair, watching silently. No one touched their coffee. No aide whispered instructions. It was just silence and tension. Kennedy pointed to another figure. Every speech about climate ends in a slogan. But this, he tapped the chart, this ends in famine. Raskin shook his head. You're presenting the problem as if doing nothing is a solution. Johnson replied instantly. We're not doing nothing. We're doing math. And the math says without fossil fuels, 4 billion people die. A beat. Kennedy leaned in slow and deliberate. You don't get to gamble with that. Padilla looked away. Raskin's lips tightened, but he didn't speak. Johnson added one final line. If your transition plan needs mass starvation to work, maybe it's not progress. Maybe it's policy suicide. Barrasso raised his gavel, not to strike, but to signal the weight of the moment. The chamber was tense, not from outrage, but realization. Kennedy closed the folder quietly. You asked us to imagine a future, he said. We're just reminding you that billions still live in the present. And before Raskin could recover, before Padilla could spin another reassurance, Kennedy reached for the next file. A series of photos were printed. Cracked roofs, flooded basement, old men wading chest-deep in water with grocery bags on their heads. This, Raskin said, his voice even but strained, is my neighborhood. Annapolis. September. The water was halfway up the mailbox. This is not theory. This is where I live. He touched on another image. Hurricane debris scattered across a collapsed porch. I've seen storms come early. I've seen tides break through lines that have been in place for generations. This isn't about charts. This is about houses. He turned to Kennedy. You sit there with a spreadsheet and talk about fertilizer. I talk about funerals. The room fell silent. A few members of the press leaned forward. For the first time, emotion overwhelmed Raskin's tone. We can't stand still because the solution is hard. We have to act because delay is fatal. Kennedy let him finish. Then he answered calmly. Storms always come, Senator. What changes is what gets in their way. More homes, more wealth, more infrastructure, more damage. That's not the climate. That's the consequences. Raskin clutched the clipboard. You think this is about insurance losses? I think, Kennedy replied. When people see more on the news, it's usually because there's more to lose, not because nature has changed its mind. Ron Johnson stood next to him. He held up a report from the Congressional Budget Office. Adjusted for GDP, hurricane losses per capita have remained virtually unchanged since 1950. What's increased is media saturation and property density. Padilla looked down at his notes. Markey said nothing. Raskin tried again. What about rising sea levels? What about my state, Maryland, with over 7,000 m of vulnerable coastline? Kennedy stepped toward the screen. Do you know how much the sea has risen in the Gulf Coast since the last ice age? Raskin shook his head. I don't care about 390 feet, Kennedy interrupted. In about 20,000 years, that's geologic time. Do you believe that anything humanity could do could stop it? Raskin didn't answer. Kennedy remained silent. Number. And the same forces that raise the seas, tectonics, orbital drift, thermal expansion, no longer require congressional approval, Johnson added. Spending trillions won't destroy nature, but it will bankrupt the families watching this hearing right now. Raskin's eyes narrowed. So, we're doing nothing? Kennedy turned, walked slowly toward the microphone. We tell the truth, and we stop selling fear as leadership. The press corps snapped photos. No one blinked. Johnson folded the newspaper slowly. Then Kennedy looked straight ahead. $6 trillion, he said. What did that buy? How much cooler is the Earth today than it was before? There was no answer. Just a glance from Padilla, a sharp intake of breath from Raskin, and the soft hum of cameras recording everything. And Kennedy, with one hand on the red clipboard, asked again, slower this time, colder and directly into the microphone. How much lower have we come down? No one said anything. And in that silence, the real question finally emerged. He placed a new document on the table and unfolded it slowly. The pages were marked with highlighted blocks, annotations, and cross-referenced agency names. These are the climate models used to justify federal spending under the Inflation Reduction Act. Every single forecast, every temperature projection, and every emissions curve sourced from the same predictive base, IPCC AR6. He looked directly at Padilla. Senator, can you tell this committee who audited those models? Padilla fumbled, hesitated. The IPCC modeling process is a collaborative international effort. It's built on peer consensus. Kennedy didn't break eye contact. So, no audit. Johnson cut in. We have private sector companies whose financial reports are audited down to the decimal. But this multi-trillion-dollar forecasting is built on self-verification. He raised a document. Where's the stress test? Where's the margin of error? Where's the competing model? Raskin interjected, arms crossed. Because the models are built on the best available science. They're not competing opinions. They're unified projections. Kennedy stepped toward him. If they're so unified, why do the projections from 2005 and 2010 not match current outcomes? Sea levels didn't rise as fast. Temperatures plateaued. Emission scenarios were off by entire continents. He gestured to the press. The models failed, but the money kept flowing. Padilla looked away. Markey finally spoke, soft and vague. The public doesn't need every technical breakdown. What they need is policy leadership. Johnson turned sharp. The public needs honesty, not a blindfold with a slogan printed on it. Barrasso remained silent, watching the room fracture. Raskin's responses were slower now, less certain. His fingers tapped on the desk. Kennedy took the moment. Senator Raskin, can you tell this committee how much of the IRA's projected climate benefit depends on these models? Raskin didn't answer. Kennedy pushed. 80%? 90%? No response. So we built national policy, tax policy, energy policy, agricultural policy, on forecasts that no one in this room has verified, peer-reviewed, or even questioned under cross-examination. Raskin leaned into his mic. If you want to turn this hearing into a war on scientists, then say it plainly. Kennedy replied without raising his voice. This is not war on scientists. This is accountability for the ones who sell certainty without evidence. Johnson stood now. If your solution cannot survive a question, it was never a solution. It was a doctrine. The air in the chamber felt heavy. A staffer in the back row closed her notepad. Barreso finally spoke, quiet and firm. Let the record reflect that no direct answer was given to Senator Kennedy's line of questioning. Kennedy took a breath. Then he said it. When faith replaces data, we are no longer legislating. We are worshiping. Raskin said nothing. Markey didn't move. Padilla stared down. And as the screen behind Kennedy went black, the silence spoke louder than any argument could. It was no longer a debate. It was a collapse of narrative. Quiet, sharp, and irreversible. The hearing room, once alive with tension, now felt like a monument to silence. Chairs stood half-emptied. Staffers filed out in quiet pairs. Barreso adjusted his notes one last time, glanced at the committee clock, and tapped the gavel once. This hearing is now adjourned. All records entered, all exhibits sealed. Full documentation will be transferred to the relevant federal oversight offices. The camera lights dimmed. Raskin remained seated, still staring forward, as if trying to find a defense in the space between facts and consequences. Padilla whispered something to a staffer. Johnson had left his folder open on purpose, its final page marked with a single sentence. No measurable climate impact verified. Across the table, Kennedy stood slowly. He didn't look at Raskin. He looked into the camera. His voice was calm, unhurried, deliberate. No one in this room was ever accused of denying climate change, he said. But someone in this country will be held accountable for denying the truth. He paused. The room waited. Then he continued, his voice sharpening. We spent $6 trillion. We passed laws. We punished industries. We taxed families. We rewrote our economy. And still, no one answered the one question that started this hearing. He stepped forward. What did we buy? How many degrees did we lower? Who did we save? And who did we sacrifice? Behind him, the screen flickered once and went dark. Johnson stepped. Up beside him, holding a flash drive between two fingers. We will submit a summary to the Appropriations Committee, and he said. And if there's no follow-up, the voters will submit their own. Barreso stood next. The record is closed. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The tone in his voice made it clear. The curtain had dropped, but the consequences were only beginning. The last image the cameras caught was Kennedy turning off the projector, the vasto chart folding away with a soft mechanical hum. The file was slid into a brown envelope, unmarked and signed. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the Capitol dome. Street lights flickered on. Protesters gathered in small nods. Some held signs demanding clean energy. Others shouted back, "Audit the trillions." It was no longer just a debate. It had become a reckoning. And as Kennedy walked toward the exit, he stopped, turned back once, and stared at the empty seat where Raskin had sat frozen. Then he spoke, not to the room, but to the country. Truth does not expire, and it does not kneel to consensus. Then he walked out. The room emptied behind him, and the door shut with a soft final click, like the sound of a case sealed.